Oh, don't stare. How would you look after eons in some ghastly crypt? Your people are rather prone to death. Mine are not. Yet when I emerged from my completely unjustified imprisonment, I found them gone. Our culture forgotten. Any trace of the world I knew all but obliterated. I must even hide my true face beneath an ever-shifting mask for fear you savages will attack me. That is how I wander this strange world. Trying to uncover the truth about a history you primitive people never even knew existed.
What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you our final character in my Divinity Original Sin 2 Origin Characters lore series. So with the recent release of the Godwoken graphic novel, we got a much more detailed version of the events each origin character in Divinity Original Sin 2 experienced before being captured by the Magisters and sent to Fort Joy, where the game begins. Just a couple of things right off the bat. What happens in the Godwoken novel is pretty well set in stone, obviously. However, what happens in the game, due to the very nature of player choice and some marketing that got released for Fallen Heroes, a game that was supposed to be a sequel to Divinity, but ultimately was put on hiatus, leaves it pretty open to interpretation of the exact canon events for most of these origin characters. Now, we can pretty well guess the canon ending for Original Sin 2. However, most of that ending still leaves what happens with the individual characters wide open. So keep in mind, I'm just going to be trying to cover, when we get to the game portion of this video, to cover just what probably happens, but keep in mind, with the very nature of player choice, a lot of things can happen and you might make entirely different choices. I'm just trying to tell the entire story here. Who is Fane? He is a scholar from the race of Eternals. The Eternals are a race from, well, basically just about the beginning of known time. Everything that we know about Eternals has obviously come way after the fact, so we don't know everything, but Fane here obviously would know a great deal of it. Specifically about Fane, he was a scholar, and he was not just any scholar, he discovered the Veil of Source that protected Rivellon from the Void. He wants to study it, to learn from it, gain power from it, help the Eternals with it. He brings this information to the King of the Eternals, known as the God King. The God King actually orders it to be left alone. He doesn't want Fane looking into it. He's fearful of the consequences of investigating it, basically. Now, after Fane goes home and laments to his wife and his daughter about this, it turns out that the king not only forbade him from dealing with this, that the king actually wound up sending guards to Fane's laboratories and research hall to basically destroy everything Fane had learned. So they basically just destroyed his entire laboratory and, shop and everything else. Fane gathers what's left of his notes and he brings all of this information to the Seven Lords. Now, I do want to take just a quick aside here. We're led to believe through all the other games that Chaos was involved in this somehow. The demon god that is mentioned in some of the earlier games. Divinity Original Sin 2 and the most couple of their modern games, they sidestep it. So Damien is often mentioned in these, and Damien draws his power from Chaos, the demon god. So we know at some point they're going to have to deal with this, but it's very clear that they are not really interested in addressing what is the deal with Chaos, the demon god. Given that Fallen Heroes was supposed to revolve around an important time in that plot, I'm guessing they either have plans for it and don't want to talk about it, or they're just not ready to talk about it. So with that out of the way, Fane brings his findings to the Seven Lords, like I mentioned, and the Seven Lords are very, very intrigued about what they could potentially do with the Veil of Source. Fane leaves his findings with the Seven Lords for them to examine and then get back to him. Now, unfortunately for him, before Fane can actually, get back to them, the God King catches wind of this, and he has Fane captured, purged of his source, and sealed in a tomb. Fane, obviously from this, doesn't actually know what happened to his family. He doesn't know what happens to the lords. And keep in mind that by very liberal estimates, at least 11,000 years have passed between this and Divinity Original Sin 2, if not way more, but like at a minimum 11,000-ish. So we fast forward a little bit, by like 11,000 years. And Fane is actually discovered by just a regular old grave robber. So a grave robber finds Fane's tomb, attempts to, rob the skeleton within, because it's, a bejeweled skeleton. And while Fane was basically left to rot in this tomb, the presence of the grave robber gave Fane a source of source that he could then drain from the grave robber to basically revive himself. And from here, he starts wandering the land, rediscovering a world he has been absent from for an incredibly long time. He learns that the seven rose to godhood by encountering the regular races of Rivellon, because, they see a skeleton walking around and they're like, praising their gods, which is the seven, because while Fane was asleep, the seven used what he discovered about the Veil of Source to rise to godhood. And this is where Fane learns about this, because scared, mortal races see him, a walking skeleton, are naturally fearful, start asking their gods to save them, and the names of their gods are people he knows personally. So he's attacked a couple times by, people who are like, oh my god, a skeleton, and he uses the faces of those people to craft his mask of the shapeshifter, which then disguises his skeleton appearance, which allows him to more freely investigate what has happened to his people who all seem to be missing. Now, over some time, he falls in with a group of bandits who have taken to smuggling artifacts that Fane recognizes as part of the Eternal Empire. He uses these people to, eventually learn the location of where these artifacts are coming from, which is none other than the Black Pits, an area outside of Driftwood in Reaper's Coast. So naturally, Fane makes all haste on his way there, but upon arriving shortly thereafter, he is attacked by Voidwoken. Now, he defends himself using Source, as well as Magisters show up, who Fane, thanks for assisting him, and then they subsequently arrest him for being a sorcerer, and he gets shipped off to Fort Joy, where people have, of course, been interring sorcerers as their powers draw in the Voidwoken. This is obviously where the game starts, so if we're playing as Fane, we will know immediately. If we're not, obviously our goal is to get off the island anyway, because it's a prison island. But that said, Fane knows he needs to get back to the Black Pits, which involves getting off this island. There's not a ton of stuff going on in Fort Joy for Fane. He can basically kind of sort out his mask of the shapeshifter situation, because when the ship that was carrying us to Fort Joy went down and capsized, his mask of the shapeshifter was lost, so he needs a new one because he is undead. So with that in mind, you can speak to Nabora, the blacksmith in the prison area of Fort Joy, who will, not want to help Fane make another one, but she points him to Niles, a guy in the Magister, barracks area. Niles is a pretty messed up dude, but Fane can trade him body parts for a face ripper, which is part of the, crafting recipe, shall we say, of getting a face to make a new mask of the shapeshifter. Or, alternatively, you can kill Wendigo, who is the person in possession of your mask of the shapeshifter, before trying to get off the island of Fort Joy, which involves a rather humorous conversation where Fane encounters Amadia, one of the seven lords turned gods that, Fane used to know. Amadia is the god for Fane. That reveals to him that Fane is now Godwoken, that is, chosen by the seven gods to potentially rise to the level of divinity. But again, to someone that knew the gods before they were gods, that's a rather humorous prospect. But regardless, at some point, you will escape the island of Fort Joy and find yourself around the Driftwood Reaper's Coast area for Act 2 of the game. Now, the main quest for this is to expand your ability to channel Source, or in Fane's case, regain your ability to channel Source. But on a more personal note, Fane needs to explore the Black Pits area, which is a dungeon, and at the very bottom of it, we can meet the Eternal Atira, which is another of the Eternal race. Atira was also imprisoned in a tomb, and in a conversation between her and Fane, we can learn what actually happened to the society that, Fane left behind. And that is, of course, that the seven lords that Fane entrusted his knowledge of the Veil with had in fact actually used that power to usurp the God King, cast him and the rest of the Eternals out into the void, and take all of that power for themselves. So after successfully learning all this information, which is what Fane was after at the very start of the game, as well as expanding our source powers to be able to channel more and more source, we can head off to the Nameless Isle in an attempt to claim divinity for ourselves. However, for Fane, the Nameless Isle is where we start learning about people being sworn to the God King. The very same God King, now in service to the Void, who had in fact ordered Fane purged and left to rot for centuries upon centuries upon centuries. However, upon entering the academy on the Nameless Isle, you will meet an emissary of the Void, that is to say the Voidwoken, and he'll talk to you and offer the God King's covenant to Fane, which you can choose to accept, by the way. Or you can turn it away and not side with the God King. If you choose to accept it, you will need a Sworn Breaker later in the game to break the covenant, as well as earning the Curse ability if you choose to take it. However, after our attempt at stealing Divinity, or taking Divinity rather, fails epically, and we find ourselves in Arx, there's really not that much going on in Arx for Fane, until you get to the very end of the game. So right before you enter Lucian's tomb, where Dallas ran off to with her stolen source from the Nameless Isle, you will encounter another Herald of the Voidwoken. This time, the Herald pleads with Fane to basically seal out the God King, but let the Eternals return to Rivellon, which is a hint at the special ending that Fane gets. Now, once we actually get to the inside of Lucian's tomb and confront Lucian himself, we will actually find out that Dallas is none other than actually Fane's daughter. It turns out that when the God King banished Fane, he also banished Fane's wife and daughter to the same fate. However, a while back, a member of the Magister Order known as Dallas the Hammer found Fane's daughter's tomb, opened it, and Fane's daughter purged her of source and took her face, thus masquerading as Dallas the entire game, when in reality, Dallas is actually Fane's daughter. Needless to say, she's very upset that Fane hadn't, ever come found her, despite that he was not exactly in a position to do so. And the person she should really be mad at is the God King, which, to be fair, she is also mad at him. Now, after a fight with potentially Lucian, but definitely the in-game boss, Brachus Rex, we get our shot at claiming Divinity and deciding the ending. Now, I mentioned Fane gets a special ending, because he does. So, in addition to purging the world of Source and restoring the Veil, Fane can also choose to allow the Eternals back in, but force the God King to be forever banished. Now, in terms of canon endings, I actually think that's probably the most likely if they want to carry the series forward. However, the world being purged of Source in general is more than likely just the canon ending, period. In that ending, the world is still purged, but the Eternals are allowed back in. So honestly, I'm kind of inclined to believe that if they want to carry the story forward and have more interesting characters, that might be the route they choose to go. Or, alternatively, Fane could be sworn to the God King and choose to let the God King and the Eternals, who are also his race, come back not just as equals, but conquerors, rather, over everyone else. The choice is yours, in that game at least, about how that ends. But suffice to say that Fane's story ends between choosing to side with the God King who once banished him, or bringing his people back while banishing the God King. So, there you go, guys. There is Fane's story in Divinity Original Sin 2 and kind of everything we know about the guy. Honestly, just a really great story. I actually really enjoyed Fane's story. I think it fits the plot. If anything, it almost feels like Divinity Original Sin 2 was written for Fane. He's a very popular character, as well as simply just being very well written. His story is very good. With that out of the way, thank you so much for watching. I truly do appreciate it. I hope you like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless, thank you again, may you wander in wisdom, and have an amazing day.